Welcome to the session, The Evolution of the Exotic. One of the large debates that's appeared in recent years in the USA is to what extent should bars reflect society today, and to what extent should bars be places to escape from reality? And most importantly, how does one balance this with the growing awareness of ideas like appropriation and cultural sensitivity? In addition to good drinks and hospitality, a great bar can offer guests the opportunity to escape their day-to-day lives for an hour or two. Bar owners have long looked to other regions and cultures, including fictitious ones, to create exotic drinking establishments, from tropically themed bars and island-style drinking dens to tequila bars mimicking Mexican cantinas. But our idea of exotic has changed over time, and some once common practices are no longer useful or in good taste. How do 21st century bars provide the opportunity for escape while balancing respect for cultural history and traditions? And how can bars deliver that idea of mystery and mystique in a globally connected world? Our speakers today are a wonderful, qualified bunch. Paul Clarke is the executive editor of Imbibe magazine and the author of The Cocktail Chronicles, a journalist who specialized in spirits, cocktails, and the culture of drink for more than 15 years. He's written for the New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Serious Eats, and many other publications, and is a member of the editorial board for the Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails. He lives in Seattle. Chris Elford is a multiple bar owner and half of one of the United States' most respected cocktail power couples, along with his wife Anu. His pedigree includes some of New York's top bars, but he now owns several of Seattle's key spots, including the Pacific Northwest-style tiki bar Navy Strength and the beer-focused No Anchor, with both receiving James Beard nominations and awards at Tales of the Cocktail. His passion is and has always been for delicious food and drinks, with an eye towards the adventurous and a caring dose of hospitality and inclusivity. And last but not least, Shannon Mustafa is a self-proclaimed spiritual advisor who was until recently bar director for Brooklyn Rum Palace Gladys. Rest in peace, damn you COVID. In addition to working with spirit brands across a range of categories, she's also one of the founders of Women Who Tiki, a roving tropical-centric cocktail pop-up that features the talents of women bartenders in venues around the US. She also has the honor of being the first African-American bartender for over 100 years to publish a book, her best-selling Tiki, Modern Tropical Cocktail. And with no further ado, over to you, folks.
Thank you very much, Angus. And we're really happy to be able to bring this to the Bar Convent audience. This is a conversation that has been happening throughout the bar world over the last couple of years, and particularly now during 2020 when bars all around the world have been shuttered because of the COVID crisis. And it's given us an opportunity to both look at our larger culture, as we've seen with the ongoing Black Lives Matter protests that have been taking place over the last several months, but also how that applies to the hospitality world. What are the kinds of lessons we can draw from this, and what are the kinds of conversations that we need to have about the way that we interact with our own culture, with other cultures, and how we show the appropriate levels of respect and honor of those kinds of traditions. So in looking at the bar world, and one of the reasons that we wanted to have this conversation is American bars and the cocktail bars have this long evolution of the kinds of atmospheres that we brought to guests. You know, we have the traditional cocktail bars that are very familiar to all of us, but also, as Angus mentioned in the introduction, people have always kind of looked for some kind of escape or some kind of, amusement that draws from other cultures, even if it's a totally made up culture out there. Tiki bars spring to mind, but also we have, Mexican cantinas, we have bars that, trying to mimic Caribbean islands or experiences there, and kind of, create these environments for drinkers to come in, for guests to come in and kind of lose themselves in a way. But what we've also seen is over the course of those decades, some of the ways that we have pursued these environments have later, we've recognized have been in poor taste or just inaccurate or in some way not respectful and not fully encompassing the range of traditions that we need to take into account. So I wanted to talk to Chris and to Shannon, because both of you guys have experience in opening bars and running bars that draw on similar kinds of traditions or some kinds of tropical style traditions, but do so in a thoughtful way and in a meaningful way. And so actually, Chris, could we start with you and just tell us a little bit about Navy Strength and what was the, kind of the concept going into the incarnation of that bar?
Navy Strength was kind of a new and my reaction to what was going on in tiki bars kind of around the country. When she and I were dating long distance, when I lived in New York and she was living out here in Seattle, we were meeting up in different cities each month and would always seek out whatever kind of tropical or tiki cocktail bar options there were there, because they're really fun, and it's just like a fun environment. But we started kind of like, Anu is Indian, and she and her parents are immigrants, and she was, very sensitive to the fact that like the places that tiki is pulling from are real places, and the things that tiki has pulled aren't necessarily entirely authentic all the time. And if they are authentic, they may have been taken without permission, essentially. And so we imagine Navy Strength as a place that, instead of kind of like honoring an idealized, kind of colonialized, often sexualized version of the tropics, we opened it in 2017. So, in 2017, we can travel to places and experience real people and real culture, and not just borrow from them, but exchange ideas with them. And so we dreamed up a bar that was influenced by the passport, making drinks that look like tiki drinks and maybe even taste like tiki drinks, but that honor real flavor styles, or service styles, real flavors, and even drink names that honor kind of like people and elements of history of these places that can make people ask the right questions, and maybe learn a little something along the way. So at the end of the day, it's still just a bar, and the drinks are still very strong in the true tiki style. But for us, I don't know, it's just the right way to do it. We got a lot of backlash at first, but a lot of the people in Seattle got it. It was more like kind of the traditional tiki people that were not super enthused, because they felt like we were maybe attacking or something. But I don't know, that it's been mostly love from the hospitality industry along the way. So
yeah. Well, and you bring up an interesting point when you talk about authenticity, because we look at some of the traditions of tiki and tropical bars, and look at the evolution of it. Tiki stretches back in some ways to the era right after Prohibition, when Hollywood was king and the Depression was upon us, and fantasy was in and rum was cheap. It also has roots much deeper in that kind of final age of exploration of when people were captivated by stories and photographs coming from Hawaii and the South Pacific, and from the years during Prohibition itself, when Cuba played a significant role in cocktail culture. So you have this kind of hybrid aesthetic coming together, drawing from Caribbean style rum drinks and Polynesian fantasy and Asian inflected cuisine. Today, we're seeing the bars that kind of less follow that traditional theme worldwide. Even though we have more or less traditional tiki bars, when bars are operational, non-COVID, of course, traditional style tiki bars still operational. Actually, many, even more of them are opening in recent years. But you also see this kind of direction going of trying to show some honest respect, but also some honest insight into these communities and in these kinds of regions. And Shannon, I wanted to ask you, obviously it's very sad to hear that Gladys is no longer with us, but while you were the bar director there, first off, tell us a little bit about the bar itself and about the community itself, and kind of how you approached that task of doing something with this kind of authentic level to it. I think you might be muted.
I can't.
Yeah. Yeah, Shannon, I think you're muted. I can't hear you.
Nope, still can't hear her.
Yeah.
Nope, we could.
So I was on a Bluetooth. Are you able to hear me now?
Yep, now I can hear you.
Okay. So thank you for your condolences regarding Gladys. Great. I owe so much to what I've been able to accomplish, and it was just a really wonderful experience. First and foremost, opening that bar, and that experience opened up my eyes to the rum category and inspired me to rethink the way I made cocktails. Uh, Gladys is in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, which is a traditionally Caribbean neighborhood. We call it West Indian here. And the intention on opening that project was to present traditional West Indian dishes, most prominently authentic jerk chicken, via using a smoker as opposed to other methods that we'd seen around town. We wanted to seize the opportunity to offer something to the neighborhood that we knew that they already loved, based on their experiences traveling in the Caribbean, but that they couldn't get here in Brooklyn. Adjacent to that was offering a rum bar that would show what the category was all about and do so by choosing bottles that offered the highest level of quality that we could find at that time. This was 6 years old. So for those of you who are in the room or have followed rum over the last 5 years, you know that there's been a significant improvement in the quality that was available by certain importers, and I think a growing interest in the bar community around how to use rum in cocktails and how to appreciate it. I have to admit, I knew nothing about tiki. I'd only been to one tiki bar up until that point. That was Painkiller, or PKNY, as it was called in this latest iteration. And that was something like 3 or 4 years prior. So I had zero exposure to tiki drinks. And it was never my intention to make it a tiki bar, A, because it's a Caribbean bar, and B, because that wasn't my background. What I wanted to do with the cocktails was to show the range of what rum could do. And initially, I was expecting a lot of backlash from the consumer, or at least some resistance, because at that time, the popular conception was that rum was sweet and tacky. And so I went with the classic 1920s era Cuban style menu. The daiquiri was the centerpiece of that menu. We would squeeze the limes a la minute into every daiquiri that we served. The bartenders hated it, but I wanted to do something that would show the guests that cocktail and rum cocktails should be really fresh and clean. And it was something that people embraced, much to my surprise. I did put a Mai Tai on the first menu because I was really intrigued by how simple the template was, and also the challenge of finding a rum blend that would come as close as I could to the original taste profile of the Trader Vic version.
Great. And so you talked about, bringing, I'm sorry, I just wasn't sure if the video had frozen. Let me start that over. You talked about bringing these kinds of classic tropical drinks, the daiquiri and the Mai Tai you mentioned, into Gladys and presenting that. And I want to ask both you and Chris, from the perspective of, presenting an atmosphere and presenting an environment for guests to come in and enjoy this kind of bar. What kinds of avenues, what kinds of opportunities do these kinds of classic tropical drinks like the daiquiri offer you to show them a glimpse of the islands, but also how do you explain the fiction that we've come up with over the course of the decades of what came about with tropical and tiki bars as drinks like the Mai Tai come up?
Who goes first?
Why don't you go first?
Well, first of all, I think it's important for us to look at bar culture not as something that's been written, but as a living document. It's one that's being written currently, and the same as the way that we would talk about bars in the 1930s as a bygone era. Someday they will be talking about bars in 2020 as a bygone. Well, that may be sooner. That retrospect may happen sadly a little bit sooner, but it's a living document. So, we're constantly writing the story, and it is important to tell, the origin stories of some of these drinks. But I think it's also important to present them to people in I don't know, to kind of like demystify them a little bit. And you know, those two drinks, like the daiquiri and the Mai Tai, are actually in flavor profile, they're quite different, but in builds, they have, you know, some pretty serious similarities, right? Rum and some sort of sweetener and lime juice. And I think that like I've always felt really good about empowering guests to fully understand like and demystify the drink a little bit, and kind of like let them feel like they're in on the joke, essentially. So that's kind of like from a more technical perspective. We started out at Navy Strength providing kind of like the history of the drinks, and we really wanted people to, you know, we had 3 sections to our menu when we first opened. We had tiki drinks, we had tropical drinks, and we had our travel menu. Our first menu, the travel menu, was Indian, so it was all India influenced drinks. You know, the tiki drinks for us were important to show people that tiki and tropical and these travel drinks were different. But to be honest with you, as time went on, we realized that like the tiki drinks, the classic ones that people are mostly into, the Mai Tai and the Zombie, people were ordering those regardless of whether or not they were on the menu. And we realized that like the story that we wanted to tell is the story of our drinks. And so today there is no tiki section on our menu. We've done away with it years ago, and we still offer those drinks and people still order them, and they're still some of our best sellers. But to us, we would rather tell our story today than someone else's story many decades ago. But that's just us.
Right. And in terms of like drink selection and telling those kinds of stories, I mean, obviously we're talking about what you have on the menu or what you had on the menu, but Shannon, you know, for your book that came out last year, when you were making the decision, you know, in 2018 and 2019 of what kind of drinks to include and what kind of perspectives to exchange in a book called Tiki, what kinds of decisions did you have to make, and what kind of, you know, questions were you asking as you were going along to best portray and best represent these drinks and the kinds of traditions and stories behind them, whether those were stories of authenticity, like something like the daiquiri, or stories that are more of the kind of fiction coming from the tiki side?
You've got more Bluetooth issues again.
Yeah.
Shannon, you want to reconnect to yourself? Oh, tricky.
Okay, can you guys hear me now?
Hear you now.
Yes.
Okay, so the intention first and foremost with Tiki Modern Tropical Cocktails was to reveal how the classical Tiki canon had inspired my take on creating tropical cocktails. And where modern comes in is opening up the door to various ingredients from around the world, you know, any place that hugged the equator, not just confined to Polynesia or the Caribbean, but opening that up to include parts of Latin America and Southeast Asia, and to show that you can continue to make tiki drinks or tiki style drinks without being confined to the classics. You know, what I've seen in tiki bars and tiki books up until that point was a devotion to the classics, which I think is great, but I wasn't seeing people stray too far outside of the canon, and I needed my book to be a little different. But that was the way I've been making tiki drinks for up to 3 years before I started work on the book. Another element that was really important was focusing on ingredients and showing the versatility of ingredients that people may not have otherwise considered for cocktails, tiki or otherwise, you know, because ingredients were, I don't know, I just love to hack it and to challenge myself to find a way to use something that I wouldn't normally consider or that I'd not seen in a cocktail before. You know, that's my MacGyver instinct that I really want to indulge in. And then third, I wanted the reader to gain confidence, not only in navigating the various rums or spirits that you could use in a cocktail, but also to build their palate and their skills and discernment along the way as they work their way through the book. So for those of you who are familiar with the book, I open up with classic rum drinks, like a really tightly edited core set of 6 that does include the daiquiri and a planter's punch. And the intention there is to kind of walk you through the various categories and styles of rum so you know what to expect in the subsequent chapters. There is a chapter on classic or foundational tiki cocktails, which are the templates that I look to come up with my originals that follow. So I don't know. It's strange because I don't think that the book itself was meant to be a tiki cocktail book, but more to show possibilities of what tropical cocktails could be by drawing on the experience of the classics.
Right. And in talking about, you said you were kind of exploring the different ingredients and different directions with your drinks. And Chris, this goes to you as well. I guess what I'm curious about is this kind of authenticity of flavor, if you will, where you're going to, for example, what we've seen over the history of tropical drinks is, drawing flavors and ingredients from around the world and, kind of presenting it as this hodgepodge of the islands. Whereas now I know at Gladys, you would have drinks that would, try to show some kind of sincerity to the ingredients coming from Jamaica and coming from the Caribbean. And Chris, with your menus at Navy Strength, for example, you have the traveling menu. You said your first menu was for India, drawing on the kinds of ingredients and flavors from those regions to really kind of put those places front and center. Can you both give us some kinds of examples of how you've tried to do this?
I mean, my breakthrough
Shannon,
moment at Gladys was using coconut oil to fat wash a vodka and to create like a type of pina colada, but a dry pina colada. I don't know that I'd seen anyone using coconut oil prior, but what really drew me to it was the floral aromatics and that nutty element. There was some creme de cacao in there and the usual suspect in a pina colada drink, pineapple juice, of course. But with that being said, one of the things that I often do when I'm using Caribbean or tropical ingredients is to try to shift your perception around what that ingredient can do and then what it can do in conjunction with other ingredients. So you read the menu, you're expecting a certain outcome, but then you're like, wow, I didn't know that chocolate could taste like this. I didn't know that coconut could taste like that. And I think that instinct is based in large part by the fact that I love cooking as a hobby. I, contemplated becoming a chef, but saw how brutal that part of the restaurant was, and I was like, I'm not really feeling that. But also, it just goes back to the tiki ethos of mystery and surprise. So I want to put that in there as well, even though the restaurant itself was not a tiki bar, but I didn't want my guests to feel intrigued by what they were tasting.
Yeah, and Chris, likewise at Navy Strength, when you look at your travel menus and you have selected a certain region, certain country, how do you try to show authenticity in terms of the flavors and ingredients that you're using?
I mean, it's really kind of like a layered approach with us. The first way I would say is that we tend to not really call out brands, but we do call out ingredients on our menus for the most part. So like right there, we've tried to place greater importance on the uniqueness of these ingredients and the specialness of these ingredients. And from every travel menu we've done, so we did an India travel menu, we did an amazing Philippines travel menu, we did a Peru menu, we've done Oaxaca, Morocco, we did a Nordic menu last winter. And these places are, obviously basically if you put pins in all these places, to quote Mitch Hedberg, you'd have enough pins in your map to hold the map up on the wall. But we try to, kind of write the flavor profiles of these ingredients that intrigue us down, and then sort of make a little web or kind of flow chart of sort of what things would work adjacent to them, and then through that kind of figure out which of those ingredients might work well together. We always have a few ingredients that are a little bit more approachable. So on the India menu, you know, we had a garam masala whiskey Collins. That was like a pretty simple take on a whiskey Collins, just with like a house-made masala mix. And then we had some more kind of exciting and unique ingredients. We had a drink that used asafoetida, which if you've ever smelled or tasted asafoetida before, it's one of the most pungent, intense. I mean, it's like an allium turned up to 11, and just a pinch of it in a cocktail's, you know, ingredient, whether it be a syrup or an infusion or something, would be overpowering to most. But I ended up, you know, through speaking with Anu, was kind of like, how the heck do you guys use this? And she was like, well, it's the kind of thing where like, you're not necessarily supposed to taste it. Like if asafoetida wasn't in the dish, you would notice that it wasn't there. But if it was in the dish, like you shouldn't notice it. And I was like, okay, so it's like, we'll use it in really scant amounts in this syrup. And she was right, you know, like in a very small quantities, it was like created this really incredibly craveable thing. And in larger quantities, it was like unconsumable. And, you know, another ingredient that we used on that India menu, and this drink is still on our menu today, we have a section of the menu now that replaced the tiki section called older passports, older postcards. And those are like basically the greatest hits from all the past travel menus. And the Kokum Cashew Swizzle is still on our menu, which is, Kokum is it's also known as jungle plum or mangosteen, but a really, really elegant, like dark fruit that's processed in different ways, much the same as coffee can be kind of like either dry or wet processed. And, you know, we just paired it with cashew and made kind of a cashew orgeat type scenario. And it's a really, really delicious swizzle, kind of in the vein of a Mai Tai, but it became one of our most popular drinks, I think because one, kokum is an ingredient that people had maybe never heard of or were generally unfamiliar with. And when they ask the question, we get all excited and get to tell them like how exciting this thing is. The coolest thing for us was that Anu's father grew up on a kokum like farm. So he got this farm to send us like kokum from the place where he grew up. And we were able to say like, not only is this ingredient like special, it's now a part of our like family tree essentially. And I think people just really connected with that.
Wow, fantastic. Now, early on, you know, when we kind of talked about the evolution of the tropical bar in America, we started in the 1930s, and there were some elements of traditional tiki that haven't aged so well. You mentioned early on, you know, some of the ethnic and racial caricatures and over-sexualized portrayal of cultures. We still see some of this stuff, unfortunately, popping up, not so much in the traditional tiki bars that we see out there, but because I think a lot of the owners of these have largely seemed to have kind of grokked of what's, you know, what kind of direction we should be heading. But there are kind of tiki-esque bars that borrow from traditions, casual racism and all. But traditional tiki has also had a sincere connection with diversity. And I want to talk about this a little bit because it's easy to kind of, you know, get into a black and white portrayal of things. But when you look at traditional tiki, you have things like, you know, Don the Beachcomber, Trader Vic's that had a heavily Filipino group of bartenders that kind of defined the things coming out of those places. And that's part of the tradition as well. How did today's bars, whether they're traditional tiki or new tropical, kind of fit into this ongoing conversation about diversity and inclusion? And how do we balance the past model of cultural appropriation with our needs now for cultural respect and authenticity?
I mean, I can say for my part, I was always interested in tiki drinks from the perspective of what they could do to showcase the diversity and the capabilities of rum. And again, you know, because of what the Gladys concept was, which is a Caribbean beach shack, essentially, it didn't make sense for me to try to present my cocktail menu as a tiki menu. It would have just been kind of pasted on. It wouldn't have fit. So I was never drawn in that direction. I think in terms of how bars and restaurants today can present cocktails from that time period or from that genre, my recommendation is to focus on the drinks and the ingredients themselves and a little less on the culture we have known it. I don't want to dismiss or decry it because that was a time period where, perceptions of other cultures and how to respect them are very different from how we look at things today. I'm not into the throwing the baby out with the bathwater approach. I'm not really very PC, and I'm not into revisionism. I'm more into, okay, so what is good about this that we can learn from and utilize, and then the other part you just leave it there, and it's fine. There's nothing that's all good or nothing that's all bad. I'm not out to correct other people. I'm just here to learn and to, take the parts that I think are worthwhile and work with that.
Yeah, I think that one thing we talked about when we all had this conversation, a similar conversation together last fall, we kind of talked about how if you take one step in the right direction, you're doing the work. And I think that is, kind of adjacent to what Shannon's saying. I also think that people are becoming more interested in narratives than concepts. And I think that, when certainly when I was first getting into cocktails, I felt like I was really interested in bar concepts, and now I'm much more interested in bar narratives. And I think that a lot of that has to do with people just being able to tell a story. And I think that people who are the best at telling stories are the ones who are good at hearing other people's stories. And that kind of becomes this like self-perpetuating thing, where all of a sudden your ears are open to what other people are saying. You're actively listening while other people are speaking. And that enables you to, that kind of like colors your world and your narrative. I think people are often disappointed when they talk to their heroes and they're kind of like, hey, I'm really excited, like your bar is like my favorite bar. And then you sit down with them for a conversation and like, you're looking for information. For me, not to speak in generalities for other people, for me, this experience was going to Sweet Liberty for the first time before we opened No Anchor and Navy Strength. And I was there drinking with John Lermayer, and I was like, hey man, I love your bar. Like, can you kind of like show me your equipment and kind of like how you set things up? Anu and I are opening these bars in Seattle, and I would love to just like get as much input from, people who have done it well before we kind of like take this on. And instead he sat me down and he was like, let me just tell you why my bar is special. It has nothing to do with the design of the bar. And I think that like, if we can convey those stories about ourselves, then we're helping do the work. Yeah. There's enough, like there's a lot of articles being written. There are conversations being had. There's more platforms for conversations to be had. I think there are simple things like, for us, like we're basically taking the word tiki and all tiki iconography out of Navy Strength right now, just and partially because of people in our industry who are Pacific Islanders and who are like, hey, even if if you're able to verify the origins of a tiki mug or statue or something, like that's still not your culture, and it's hurting up, like you're perpetuating it even if you're doing it right. And so for us, we were like, cool, we'll take that stuff away and like, focus on some other things. And in doing so, we have to kind of like declassify ourselves on some of the online services as a tiki bar, which means that like people who are searching for bars like ours will no longer probably find us as easily as they could. And so in that way, like we're hoping that, I guess some words like tropical do become a little bit more popular, because we still want to like reach the same crowd that we're reaching. We think that they're excited about us. I just think that like, it's probable that the word tiki as a classification of bar is going to become like less and less useful as time goes on. But that's just us and what we're hearing and what we're kind of like considering.
Right, right. And when you look at the background, as we were talking about with the original inception of this seminar, of the evolution of the exotic, and, you know, the air quotes around the exotic, because it's our conception of what's different, what's interesting, what's fascinating changes over time, but still there's that desire. People are still looking for that kind of fantasy, that kind of escapism that kind of gave birth to tropical bars and tiki bars, as well as all different kinds of bars over the years. We talked about authenticity, we talked about being sincere to these places, but how do we still have that room for fantasy? How do we still leave that door open for creativity and for kind of immersion in that particular environment? Because especially now, you know, 2020, it's a rough year. And people, you know, depending on where you are, can't necessarily go to bars or can't be inside that kind of immersive environment. But people are looking for that kind of experience, and I assume will be in the future. How do we continue to provide that, knowing what we know now, and from this discussion that we're having now?
I mean, there's no catch-all on how to do it, because it's all in the eye of the beholder. You know, I want to go back to this word exotic. You know, what is exotic? Again, it varies from person to person, but the whole point of it is escapism, as you pointed out. And I mean, I think any bar offers that to some degree, but exotic and tropical and tiki bars make that the emphasis, if you will. I think, you know, the way that can be done will vary from city to city, or the intention of the proprietor and what they see their community wanting or needing. But, you know, Chris, I got to talk about, you know, this idea that, you know, the bar doesn't have to be tiki, it can be tropical, it can be nautical. When I visited Navy Strength, I just got a nautical theme. And what do people think about when they think about boats? It's like, I'm traveling, I'm probably somewhere warm, you know, maybe there's some beaches involved at some point. So, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean the South Pacific, it can mean the Caribbean, it could mean, you know, the coast of South America, it could mean the Amalfi Coast, it could mean Monaco, it can mean so many things. And I don't know, I just have to say that, and I'm curious about you guys' thoughts on it. There's this like, oh, well, you know, a tiki bar is exploiting Polynesia, but I mean, I don't see people on the witch hunt for Italian restaurants that are owned by people born and raised in the USA that maybe don't have any Italian lineage. I think there's a recognition there's something really special about Italian cuisine and aperitivo culture, and people enjoy that. You know, I don't see the same backlash against French restaurants, nor certain, you know, styles of Asian restaurants that may be run by a chef that didn't grow up in Asia or isn't Asian. I don't know, I find that part curious. And I think that, you know, that the European roots of those cuisines, maybe people are a little less concerned about this idea of appropriation or exploitation, but I like to think there's a thin line between appreciating something and wanting to, you know, serve something that you enjoy to other people that I don't think inherently involves ripping other people off. I don't know.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree with that. I mean, I think that like where I kind of like the words that I look at, like colonialism, you know what I mean? Like the real people that you and I both know who are like Pacific Islanders have said like, hey, like white people came here and like colonized our island, you know, did the worst things imaginable that you can do to a people. And then now we see this represented in these, so for me, like that is enough for me to say like, okay, like I can do what you were saying and do, I mean, you called to like the natural world. You're right. Like everywhere that has beaches, you know, beach glass, flora and fauna that you might see like along the beach, like those are ways that you can kind of like, to Paul's question, like create an environment in which people feel like they can escape. Like where I'm realizing that I've like misstepped and that, you know, others have probably misstepped in the past is like using just like native or religious iconography that wasn't mine or ours to use And I think that like in the case of Italian restaurants and French restaurants, you know, like that's not necessarily as, you know, it's not like people are kind of like, that those weren't like colonized places by another people. So, you know, but there probably are people who are upset one way or another. And it's like, it goes back to authenticity and maybe like appreciation. Like, I do think that there is, that there are people, you know, I think of the two white women in Portland who started the like tortilla, little stand, and everyone freaked out because they had like gone down to Mexico and learned how to make tortillas. And people in Portland were like, this is authentic. Like, you basically went down and like stole from these people and started a business. And like, everyone freaked out on the internet and put them out of business. But at the end of the day, if you think about it, they might not have gone about it in exactly the right way or explain themselves in the right way. But like, if you have an appreciation for a people and like a food like that, you should be able to show that appreciation. You know what I mean? Just as long as like you're having the conversation with the right people, you're having it publicly, and you're saying like, yo, this food like really, really, really touched us, and we want to spend like our careers celebrating it. You know, I think that people can get down with that.
Yeah,
I don't
think
want to
the
belabor it,
respect.
but I'm sorry. I just want to throw this in there in response to what you just said, Chris. I mean, again, the cancel culture is rampant. You know, I do believe these individuals had a sincere love for that food, and they were like, we want to share this with other people. And so to say, well, you can't do it because you're not
Totally
from there,
agree.
I think that's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And like, that's part of like what I was saying earlier about how this is all a living document, is I think that people should, like, as we change like restaurant and bar culture in every way, we have to give people like room to change and improve and all grow together. And like, not, you're right. Like, I think that like cancel culture in bars and restaurants like isn't necessary, because I think that we've done a good job of like communicating with each other and kind of like growing together. You know, I think of like Shelby and Paul at Lost Lake, like those, like everything that they do, I feel like is thoughtful and tasteful, but those are like the least preachy people I've ever met in my life. And Paul is like very much a tiki aficionado. And you know, you're right. I think that there's a lot of damage that you can do and like make people feel like outsiders with cancel culture, when you could just like in love say like, hey, look, we're doing it this way. We're excited about this, you know?
Yeah. And I think, you know, that element of respect and of actively listening and thinking about it really kind of comes into play. And as you mentioned earlier, we've been talking a lot about tiki and tropical, but I didn't want this conversation to get stuck in that, because when you think about things like, you know, when I first came of drinking age many, many years ago, and you would go to a tequila bar, then there were all these kinds of like Mexican caricatures involved with sombreros and, you know, the bandoliers of shot glasses and the whole things that are, you know, kind of almost cartoon elements drawn from this, you know, outdated perspective of Mexican culture. But nowadays, or in recent years, if you've gone to places like, you know, Ghost Donkey, or gone to Leyenda, places that, you know, embrace the spirits and the flavors and the kinds of traditions of these places, but do so in a meaningful way and in an honor, you know, in a way that is meant to show respect and honor and to introduce people to this. I think that's all good. You know, it's a way of kind of, you know, moving this conversation forward, introducing wider audiences to these flavors, but also to these cultures.
Yeah,
Absolutely agreed. It's like, how well researched is product and how good is the execution? That to me is the criteria. Like, if you're showing that you actually know what you're doing and you're doing it well consistently, I don't understand what the problem is there. Because as you pointed out, now that product, that experience, that culture is available to people when maybe it wouldn't be. It just seems like a plus.
Right. Well, I think we're getting close to the end of our time here. That's all the questions I had. Was there anything I didn't ask that you guys wanted to make sure that you mentioned? Or Angus, was there anything that you wanted to pose to the panel?
No, I thought that was a great summary of an important topic at the moment. I mean, obviously we're seeing, you know, I've thought for some time that bars of many different styles have become almost theme bars. You know, the speakeasy revolution was basically 1930s theme bars, etc. We've seen a lot of interest in Asian bars, Japanese in particular, with people, you know, geeking out on Japanese philosophy and Japanese bartending techniques that they learned on YouTube. But I do think doing proper research, realizing that if you think there is any doubt in your concept, that you check in with people who might be able to give you that sense check, from reaching out to the Pacifica project to ask, is there anything here that might offend people who are passionate about their cultures? So, we live in a globally connected world, and it is great to try and show off different countries. We just have to be sensitive about what is allowable and what is potentially problematic, and making sure that we don't raise that. But no, I thought this was a great discussion.
Fantastic. Great. Well, thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Joe.
you. Thank you guys both for joining in on this and continuing this conversation that we started last year. It would have been really nice to see you in Brooklyn this summer, but
All right. Thanks a lot, folks.